It is good to be able to be back. Thanks again, Robert and Susan, for working so hard for such a wonderful Love and Justice series with beautiful music and speakers that challenged us and nurtured us and sustained us. It's wonderful to have the DS here again. Who knows? All my preacher friends, sometimes you're glad when the DS shows up, and I have been so far. Let's keep it that way. It is good. It's good for us to take that time to hear other voices. I think that's part of the beauty of what we do and the multifaceted group of preachers that are here and speak and talk for us, teach us. That I learn something all the time. Sometimes I learn what not to do, mostly from me. And then other times I learn how to open my life up before God and to continue to allow that to nurture my soul and spirit. And so today we gather around the table for communion. It just happens to be the first Sunday of the month, but it also is part of our gospel story this day, as a gathering of people around Christ. This is a unique story because part of it is kind of it's a rarity. It's the one story or one of the few stories throughout the gospel lessons, gospel stories of Jesus' interaction with us, that is present in all four of the Gospels. Although it takes on a different story and a different slant in whichever gospel it is, it makes a difference. That they're all there. This is an important story to the early church. That's one of the understandings that we can see. That this story, this feeding of the 5,000, is an important story for the early church. Jesus, this is following the news of Jesus hearing that John the Baptizer has been killed. So Jesus, hearing this devastating news of his cousin's death, goes off to be alone, to be deserted. One could argue that Jesus was an introvert by nature. Leave me alone. I just want to be here in a quiet place. Jesus is trying to get away from everybody and in fact takes a boat, it says, and goes off to a deserted place by himself. But lo and behold, when you read the text closely, it says that when he got off, there were people, followers, who were already there. You know how that goes. My neighbor's yard man, Monday afternoon, preacher, I've worked Sunday, I've come to the office, we've gotten stuff kind of started for the week, and sometimes on Monday afternoon I'll go back to the house and think, I'm going to lay here, eat a sandwich, and I'm going to lay here about 15 minutes in my chair and take a nap. And you won't believe who shows up every Monday afternoon. My neighbor's yard man. My 3 neighbors' yard man that runs the mower all afternoon. I'm like, there's a couch at the church. I might go, but I'm afraid Leslie will scare her if she shows up to clean. And I'm laying up there, passed out on a couch somewhere. And she would scream, and I would wake up, and it would not be good. I would be like, oh my God, I'm scared to death. I think the neighbor's yard man has a tracking device and sees my car pull in the driveway, and it's like, I gotta go right now. So I can empathize just a little bit with Jesus coming up. Can you imagine that? You're just trying to be left alone. And you go off to hide from the world and the news around us. And lo and behold, it finds you every time. It's like the beauty of, your smartphone. I want to be left alone. I don't want to hear what's going on in the world just for a little bit. And lo and behold, it is urgent breaking news come through. It's something else. It's another email. It's another spam call. Just so you'll know, if you get the call from Medicaid that we got, or Medicare that we got this week at the church office, and they ask you how old you are, now they called the church office. And they said, we want to check in on your Medicare. What is your age? And I thought, well, we're about 123. So when I answered, they said, what's your age? I said, 123. They said, we cannot help you. Goodbye. It's a secret. Don't tell. But I just was trying to get some stuff done in the office. I wanted to be left alone, and the blooming phone rings. Jesus was fully human. I'm sure he pulled up on the shore from his boat, and all those people were there, and they're like, oh, look, I don't feel well. And Jesus like goes into work mode again. He's like, I was just trying to get away. The deserted cabin in the woods sounds pretty good sometimes. But the people were there, and Jesus had compassion on them, healed them, because that's who Jesus is. You know, maybe that model of faith is just a little bit for us. There's a balance in taking time away and doing work, and sometimes the work keeps coming. The work of the world keeps coming because we're gospel people. Jesus shows up on shore, people show up, heal me, I'm sick, help me, and he does. And it gets worse. Not only are all these people, then suddenly the disciples show up. You know, it says that Jesus went off in a boat by himself, got up on shore, there's all these people, and then later, verse 15 or something like that, 16, it says the disciples are there, and you're like, oh, geez, great. Those rogue renegades, you know, that's just not what you wanted to see, not what you want to do. They show up, and Jesus begins this interaction with them. And the disciples, you know, there's a certain part in life when we have to realize, as my theology professor said, one of the most comforting thoughts every morning when he woke up was the fact that he woke up and he realized that once again he was not God that day. Those disciples show up, and they're beginning to give Jesus advice on what Jesus needs to do next. The very Son of God was getting advice from these bunch of ruffians who kept messing up. Matthew's gospel is a whole lot kinder than the disciples, as sometimes as Mark's gospel is. Kind of soft pedals it. They weren't as bad as the other gospels make them out to be in Matthew. But they were still, you know, you just want to take them and shake them. They're like, here, Jesus, you need to send them away so they can go to the village and buy them something to eat, so they can be self-resourceful. Jesus, you need to do this. What's Jesus say back to the disciples? Y'all need to feed them. Not me. This is your job. And then the disciples all of a sudden say, all we've got is these 5 loaves and 2 fish. Yep, that's it. Now, in some of the other Gospels, it says, what do you have? And, you know, then we hear the story of the boy offering up his 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and they begin to put this together. But in Matthew, it's just there. It's part of the beauty of communion. You know, sometimes it's just here. It's just present for us. It's on the table when we get here. We receive communion. We go back to our seats. Part of that I love. In the United Methodist Church, you know, the beauty of coming forward for communion. Part of what we do when we come outside the fence, the altar area, is the gifts of bread and juice are being offered to you. The grace of God is being offered to you. It's given to you. Don't reach up and try to get a piece of bread off of the loaf I've got, because you ain't going to make it. Because it's not for you to take. It's for Jesus to give us. That we're given this bread, we're given this juice. We receive it and we're nurtured and sustained. Not because of something we do, although there's some personal responsibility in that, as we're able to come forward to communion. There is a personal responsibility about that. There's only so much God can do. There's some free will still around in the world. You know, I'm both glad and saddened to have to tell you this, that you are not a puppet on a string. That our hearts and our minds work together. We feel with God's grace present in our lives, even before we realize it, working in and through us for God's grace to grow and to be sustained and nurtured, and we're changed. Not because of our own work, but because of God's grace allowing us and enabling us to be transformed. But there is a personal responsibility. There's a personal task at hand as well. We've got to work too. I love Pope Francis's comment about prayer. That part of the prayer is that we pray about it, we pray to God about it, and then we begin to work for it. It's not just we pray and leave it to God. It's that we have to work. We have to work for transformation. That's why we talked about love and justice. That's what it means to be able to be committed to love and justice in the world. It's what it is to be committed to Christ in our lives. To be transformed because we've been nurtured and sustained and given the power to be able to do so. Now, Jesus, I don't know how he does it. He goes from hearing that his first cousin's been dead, that he begins to heal people, and not long after that, he's beginning to feed 5,000 men and women and children, so there were probably more than that. There may have been 12, 15,000. They all were fed from that loaf, those few loaves and that few fishes. And then he goes and walks on water just after that. Now, I'm not saying don't try it. Brian, when you go out there in the ocean, don't try it. Might not work, but it might. I mean, if you do, send me a postcard, let me know, take a picture. But Jesus is able to go and do even more wondrous things, even after being kind of this challenged to feed the people. That's just who Jesus is. More amazing and more gifted and more able than anything we can even envision in our mind. Jesus isn't us. Jesus is Jesus. And because it's Jesus, Jesus can do a whole lot more. We remember that as part of being part of the Christ Church, to be able to be reminded to know over and over again that it's not our work, it's Christ's work, and that when we join together and Christ joins with us, that the abilities of God to transform the world around us are massive. Yep. Jesus just keeps going. One thing after the other. In Matthew, there is a story of sending out the disciples, but we never get a report back of how they did. There was no charge conference report to have to fill out. They went out, then they came back. But in Mark, there's a report, but not in Matthew. And yet somehow Jesus continues to sustain and to work for them. Where is it that we're being called? Where is it that we're being called to offer up what we have for the world around us? You know, somewhere the loaves and the fishes, they came just from the disciples. Maybe from a young boy who was willing to share. We don't know. But they arrived and they were there. And Jesus gave thanks for them. And they all had something to eat. And there was enough left over to fill 12 baskets full. Sometimes the biblical scholars tell us that those 12 baskets will represent all the 12 tribes of Israel, all of God's creation. That there's enough of left over to sustain and to fulfill and to feed all that God has created. Wow. Definitely not a gospel of scarcity here. The amazing power and love of God, it doesn't just dwindle down. It continues to grow. It's like a candle. I love that on Christmas Eve when we do a candlelight service. You know, and you share your flame, you dip the unlit candle into the lit candle. You know, like, does it grow dimmer? Does that candle grow dim because it shared its flame? No, it just keeps brightening and brightening and brightening the room around us. And maybe, perhaps, through being nurtured and sustained by God's Spirit, through the bread and through the juice, that we too are strengthened, that we're encouraged, and the world gets a little brighter through the work of God. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.